The White House is sold as a perfect symbol, pure marble, clean lines, a promise carved in stone. But run your hand across that stone, and you touch a story few postcards mention. This House of Liberty was raised by people who had none. Enslaved men cut the sandstone at a government quarry. Enslaved women cooked, cleaned, and cared for presidential families under the same roof where freedom was debated. In 1814, British troops burned the mansion. The shell survived. A century later, the floors sagged so dangerously that engineers stripped the interior to its bones and rebuilt it with steel, while the famous façade stayed smiling for the cameras. The symbol stayed. The inside changed. If this is the nation's living room, whose fingerprints are in the paint? Tonight, we open hidden doors, labor in the shadows, myths that became schoolbook truths, and the renovation that made the old White House largely new inside. Symbols steer nations. The White House isn't just a building, it's a stage set for democracy. What we choose to show on that stage shapes how millions of people understand America. If the story centers only on elegant receptions and decisive presidents, we miss the cooks, the carpenters, the gardeners, and the children who slept in attic rooms after long days of work. We miss the people the symbol leaves out. Why care now? Because public memory is policy's quiet partner. When a country forgets who built its landmarks, or how myths replace messy truths, classrooms repeat the omissions, tours flatten complexity, and the next generation inherits a narrative that seems clean, simple, and comforting. And untrue. There's another stake: accountability. Inside these rooms, decisions have redrawn borders, launched wars, and expanded rights. The distance between the people who make decisions and the people who live with them often shows in who gets remembered. Telling the full House story reconnects those worlds. It also complicates familiar legends: the portrait rescue, the perfect facade, the idea that the original house remains untouched, so we can admire the symbol without sanding down history. If you've ever stood at the fence, peering through black bars at a glowing portico, tonight you'll step inside with context. We'll follow the stone from quarry to cornerstone, watch the mansion burn, and see engineers hang floors from a new steel spine. By the end, the White House will feel less like marble on a postcard and more like a ledger of American choices. Before the president moved in, there was just a muddy construction site on a wind-scoured hill. The plan was bold: a president's house fit for a republic that refused to call its leader a king. The style, neoclassical, promised virtue and order. The reality on the ground was noise, debt, and dust. In 1792, an Irish-born architect, James Hoban, won a design competition. His drawings were elegant and efficient, big ideas that could be built with the tools and skills at hand. Commissioners overseeing the new federal city hired crews fast. They needed sawyers, quarrymen, carpenters, teamsters, masons, cooks. To fill those jobs, they did what many officials in the new capital did. They rented enslaved people from local owners and mixed them with hired free workers and recent immigrants. If you could walk the site, you'd see the logistics first. Barges push upriver from Virginia. Oxen lean into yokes. Teams wrestle pail blocks off wagons. Supervisors squint at lists. Money is short. Time is tight. The icon is not inevitable. It's improvised. The stone came from Aquia Creek, a government-run quarry roughly 40 miles south. There, enslaved quarrymen and hired workers cut sandstone that was soft when lifted and hardened after exposure, perfect for carving courses and trim. Training happened on site. Men learned to square blocks, dress faces, and repeat the module again and again. The system turned a quarry into a school and a river into a conveyor belt. The capital marketed itself as a break with old-world hierarchy, yet the build looked familiar: coercion at the base, refinement at the top. Enslaved men hauled timber and stone. Free black carpenters and masons took skilled roles, sometimes leading small teams. Irish and Scottish joiners cut architraves and stair parts by hand. Hoban's foremen kept the pace with chalk lines and daybooks. Everyone answered to a schedule the weather didn't respect. We do know this. The record books list payments for hire of Negroes, for dieting workers, for hauling, for nails and lime and whiskey. The books are meticulous about materials and vague about people. Some entries show only a first name, Tom, Peter, Nace, or none at all, just a count. The erasure is baked into the paperwork. Inside the city, the workforce pushed through summers thick with mosquitoes and winters that cracked mortar. The site was a mess of scaffolds, pits, and temporary sheds. Cooks, often enslaved women, kept kettles boiling for men burning thousands of calories a day. At night, laborers slept in rough quarters near the yard or walked back to crowded alleys in Georgetown. The earliest walls rose in tidy courses, sandstone sills and lintels framed windows that would one day host state dinners and television lights. Back then, they were holes to toss out debris. Floors were heavy timber, fastened with hand-wrought nails. The roof trusses, long, clever triangles, spanned the principal rooms like ribs. 19th century quarrymen drilled a line of shallow holes in a row. They slid metal feathers into each hole and tapped a wedge, the plug, between them. Strike in sequence and the stone parts along a straight plane. It's precise, loud, and rhythmic. On a good day, dozens of blocks split cleanly. On a bad day, the stone shears crooked and the crew starts over. The house took shape as a machine for service. Long passages let servants move unseen. Rear yards held ash pits, privies, and animal sheds. A deep well supplied water. Cisterns collected more. The façade promised Republican simplicity. The back showed the cost of that performance. Labor built into the architecture, just out of view. The timeline was tight because the city itself was a bet. Congress would sit here. The president would live here. To make that happen, commissioners borrowed, bargained, and when needed, looked away. Ads went up seeking to hire enslaved workers by the month. Overseers and owners negotiated rates. If a man was injured, the books note, lost time, not the length of his recovery. James Hoban, meanwhile, walked the line between art and schedule. His elevations balanced restraint and ceremony. Chimneys punctured the skyline like punctuation marks. Interiors aimed for symmetry and light. But symmetry can't lift a stone. People do. People with hands calloused by river rope and quarry dust. There's a legend about the White House cornerstone and whether the men who laid it left it so well hidden that no one could find it later. What matters more is the ceremony beneath the myth, a nation eager for symbols, blessing a building even as it borrowed the labor practices of its time. The bravado is real. So is the contradiction. Consider the carpenters. Many were immigrants who carried their apprenticeship across an ocean. They knew sash joints, housed tenons, and how to make a door swing true without a metal hinge visible. They also knew how to teach. On site, skill flowed sideways. Enslaved and free workers learned by doing, then taught the next set of hands. Knowledge crossed lines that law tried to harden. Lime mortar matters. It's forgiving. It breathes. When moisture moves through the wall, the mortar sacrifices itself, not the stone. That choice, common then, praised again today, helped the shell survive future disasters. Every scoop a mason placed helped buy time that no one in 1792 could imagine. And then there's the rhythm of pay. Free workers drew wages, often late. Enslaved workers drew none. Their owners did. The house is a ledger as much as a structure. You can read the values in the balances. A midday bell called men to eat. The site quieted, then swelled back into motion. A foreman checked progress with a rod and a practiced eye. Is the course level? Are the joints tight? Can we set one more block before the light goes? By 1796 to 1797, the walls had a presence. Visitors could see rooms forming, an entrance hall that would someday host lines of guests, parlors planned for receiving days, service stairs tucked away for carrying coal and food unseen. The promise of a public house in a country without a palace. And yet, a household too, where someone would wake before dawn to stoke stoves and scrub floors. The men at Aquia worked the winter to stock blocks for spring. Ice closed the river sometimes, halting transport. When thaw came, barges moved again. Crews at the site cheered deliveries like a modern build cheers a steel drop. Each cart meant another day closer to closing in the roof. Even in the 1790s, the president's house was a destination for gawkers. Travelers described a city half idea, half mud. They stared at the shell and argued whether the country needed grandeur. Some loved the dignity, others smelled monarchy. The workers kept working. The debate didn't move a single stone. The White House is not marble. The principal exterior is sandstone, later painted to protect it. The paint hid patched areas and unified old and new work across decades. The glow on camera is chemistry as much as design. By 1800, the site was a compound. Outbuildings supported the main house. The interior still lacked many of the luxuries we associate with the presidency. No electricity, no central heat. But there were rooms, doors, and a roof. There was a kitchen complex that would demand sweat every single day. There were quarters for servants, some enslaved, some free, whose lives threaded through the halls of power without leaving portraits on the wall. Pause on one image. A boy, enslaved, carrying a bucket up a tight service stair. His footfalls are soft from practice. He knows where the tread creaks. He knows which door to avoid when a certain man is in a mood. He cannot vote. He cannot leave. Yet his labor shapes the comfort of the most public private house in America. This is the ledger page that underlies everything that follows: the burning, the rebuilds, the ceremonies, the photos. The first decade wrote the contradictions in stone and policy. Once you see them, they keep showing up. The house opened enough to be used by 1800. John Adams moved in late that year, writing by candle about rooms echoing with unfinished work and cold. The paint was fresh, the plaster still cured. Outside, the city remained a construction zone. Inside, a domestic routine settled in, formal on the surface, relentless beneath it. War has a way of testing symbols. By the summer of 1814, British forces had slipped past America's coastal defenses. After a ragged U.S. defeat at Bladensburg, the road to the capital lay open. That afternoon, word reached the president's house. The enemy was coming. Inside, Dolley Madison was waiting for news from her husband James, who had ridden out to consult with the militia. She wrote of straining through a spyglass, watching the horizon, weighing what to pack. Servants rushed fragile things into trunks. The house smelled of dinner. The staff had prepared a formal meal, expecting the president's return. Instead, the British arrived. Officers paused long enough to sit at the table. Accounts say they toasted the victory with American wine, then set to work. Orders targeted government structures, the Capitol, departments, and the president's house. What burned in the mansion was not just wood and fabric, but the idea that this glittering new nation was out of reach. The flames said otherwise. The sandstone shell endured heat that buckled hardware and melted paints into foul, sweet-smelling smoke. Roof timbers fed the blaze, curtains flashed, carpets curled, furniture collapsed into beds of coals. Later, investigators would find smoke stains seared into places no one expected. That night, the White House became a lantern, visible for miles as if the city had raised its own warning beacon. And what of the portrait? This is where myth meets memory. The full-length Gilbert Stuart of George Washington, now iconic, hung in the state dining room. Stories for generations placed Dolley as the one who cut it down and carried it to safety. It's a potent image. The First Lady rescuing the father of his country under enemy fire. It neatly affirms courage, patriotism, and domestic grace. But the best eyewitness thread belongs to Paul Jennings, enslaved to James Madison, about 15 years old in 1814. In his later memoir, he described the scramble. Dolley ordered that the portrait not be surrendered. Staff, Jean-Pierre Sousa, and Jennings among them, worked to remove it. The frame was too large and bolted to the wall. They had to break it and carefully cut the canvas from its stretcher. Then, according to multiple accounts, two New Yorkers, Jacob Barker and Robert de Peyster, carried the rolled painting away. Dolley oversaw and insisted. She didn't do the cutting, and she didn't carry it herself. The correction isn't about taking glory from a first lady. It's about restoring the people in the room to the room. Enslaved workers and staff, trained, decisive, and fast, did the physical saving. Their names belong beside hers. When Jennings printed his account in 1865, he did more than settle a detail. He challenged how the nation assigns heroism inside its most symbolic house. Classrooms favor clean arcs, but the White House's truths are often collaborative, messy, and dependent on people whose names were left out of ledgers. Outside, the night cracked open. After the torching, a violent storm tore through Washington. Witnesses described a furious wind that ripped roofs free and flipped cannon. Some later called it a tornado. Whatever the meteorology, the storm doused embers and drove the British back toward their ships. The capital was a soaked, smoking ruin. At daybreak, the president's house looked like a blackened shell. The stuccoed sandstone, painted to protect against weather, was streaked and blistered. The roof was gone. Floors had collapsed into heaps, yet the walls still stood like a rib cage after a fire. What happened to the people who had served there? Many had fled with the family and staff the night before, hauling whatever they could. In the confusion, enslaved workers navigated a double risk: the invading army and the possibility of being seized or blamed. Some black residents of Washington did escape to British lines in hopes of freedom. Others stayed and rebuilt alongside neighbors, no matter how the paybook named them. Dolley Madison returned to survey the damage weeks later. Imagine the silence of those rooms, plaster powder on your shoes, char clinging to your fingertips. The city debated whether to move the capital. Practical voices argued for fresh ground. Political pride pushed for a rebuild. It didn't take long. The decision came to re-raise the president's house using the surviving shell. That choice mattered. It said the symbol would endure where it fell. It also meant the house would carry a memory of catastrophe inside its walls. Years later, conservators would uncover fire scars tucked under layers of paint, ghost notes that confirmed the night the rooms burned. James Hoban came back to direct repairs and reconstruction. He reused any stone strong enough to hold a course and replaced what had cracked beyond saving. Crews reset lintels, recut moldings, and replanned interiors damaged beyond recognition. They worked fast. By 1817, President Monroe could occupy parts of the house, though finishing continued. In a way, the early rebuild is the mansion's first great act of public memory. Repair as narrative, that the White House's grace always depended on labor you weren't meant to see. In crisis, that labor stepped forward, literally lifting the nation's face off a wall and carrying it into history. Paul Jennings's life didn't end with the rescue. Decades later, he would gain his freedom and publish his recollections. His short book doesn't thunder, it corrects. It reminds readers that house legends are often assembled around familiar figures, while the people who hauled, cooked, and decided under pressure get footnoted or erased. Tonight we do the opposite. We put them back on the main line of the story. Yes, British officers really ate the meal the Madison staff had set out. It's a detail so cinematic it sounds invented. It isn't. The fact lands because it shows how fast power can flip. A table laid to honor a president becomes a victory spread for those who burn his home. By the end of 1814, the city had begun to stitch itself back together. The president's house would rise again with familiar lines. From the lawn, it would look the same: calm, balanced, official. Inside, new wood touched old stone, and fire shadows lingered in the cavities of walls. One last image before we leave the ashes: a rolled canvas carried out of chaos by men who knew exactly what they were doing, an enslaved teenager helping to cut it free, a doorkeeper directing, 2 volunteers taking the weight. That's how national memory should move. Many hands, named visible. We're ready for what comes next: haste, pride, and an astonishing rebuild that would restore the house's shape and plant seeds for a structural crisis a century later. The fire left a ribcage. James Hoban returned in 1815 to make it a body again. He saved what he could: exterior sandstone walls, some masonry partitions, and threaded new timber through the old bones. By 1817, President James Monroe could live in parts of the house. It looked familiar from the lawn. Inside, it was a patchwork of salvage and fresh carpentry. The White House gained its most photogenic features in this era. The south portico went up in the 1820s, an elegant semicircle that made the back of the house feel like a ceremonial stage. The north portico followed at the decade's end, a classical porch that turned the front door into a frame for arrivals. Both were gestures and infrastructure at once: shade, shelter, spectacle. Monroe's receptions restarted a tradition as old as the early republic. The People's House could feel public, on schedule. Crowds threaded through halls to shake a president's hand, to be seen being there. But the machine behind the ceremony was constant: cooks, doorkeepers, chambermaids, and footmen managing flow, cleaning spills, stoking heat, keeping a palace that pretended not to be one. As decades rolled, the mansion modernized, often awkwardly. Gaslight crept in by mid-century, brightening rooms but blackening ceilings with soot. Indoor plumbing spread in fits, first to key spaces, then more broadly as pipes and water pressure improved. The house inhaled coal heat, exhaled cinders, and learned to live with smoke. Staff carried scuttles up service stairs. Ashes went out the back before dawn. The Civil War turned the White House into a nerve center. Abraham Lincoln paced halls worn by receptions and dipped a pen in the same rooms used for parlor talks. Washington bristled with troops and telegraph lines. Policy and war planning shadowed domestic routine, a child's toy on a windowsill, a general in the hall. In 1862, the district ended slavery by law. The contradiction of a house built with enslaved labor, slowly, painfully, bent toward change within the very city that had profited from it. By the late 1800s, technology accelerated. Electric lights arrived in 1891. The story goes that President Benjamin Harrison and his wife were wary of switches. Staff handled the current. Whether nerves or prudence, it's a fitting metaphor. New systems threaded into old walls, and the old walls weren't always ready. The bigger strain wasn't light, it was people. Government grew. The president's staff grew with it, spilling out of the family residence. Corridors meant for trays and coal became hallways for policy. A temporary office annex sprouted near the conservatories on the west side, then outgrew itself. By 1901, the clutter and crowding were so bad that Theodore Roosevelt called in McKim, Meade, and White, the nation's star architects, to redraw the map. 1902 delivered the modern arrangement, a West Wing for work, the executive residence for living and ceremony. The change did two things. It protected the domestic core from the daily crush of politics, and it admitted that the presidency had become an all-day, all-staff operation. The architects stripped Victorian layers, brightened rooms, simplified trim, and cut new vistas to make the residence feel airy and formal again. Even the idea of an office shifted shape. In 1909, William Howard Taft added the first Oval Office, a room whose geometry echoed the Blue Room's ceremonial curves and matched the theater of modern media. It broadcast continuity while tacitly admitting change, more staff, more scheduling, more symbolic staging. The White House absorbed pain, too. On Christmas Eve, 1929, a fire ripped through the West Wing during Herbert Hoover's term. The blaze, likely fueled by wiring in the attic, warped beams and wrecked offices. Rebuilding was fast. The photography is stark. Charred studs, a sky where a ceiling should be. The takeaway was blunt. Modern systems had outpaced the mansion's old skeleton. Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933 with the Great Depression raging and a radio audience listening. He needed a workspace that matched the tempo of crises. In 1934, the West Wing expanded and the Oval Office moved to its present spot closer to the Rose Garden. A cabinet room took shape beside it, corridors widened. The idea was flow. Aides could move fast between desks, press, and the president without parading through family spaces. Meanwhile, the executive residence, the symbolic heart, kept aging. Every update added weight and risk. Heavy chandeliers, new plaster, more wiring, more radiators, more people. Floors that had once carried family life now bore the footsteps of staff, security, and a small army of guests. Hairline cracks widened, doorways sagged a hair. You could make it pretty with paint, but not strong with paint. There were bright, human moments amid the creep of stress. Children slid down the banisters. Spring receptions filled rooms with flowers. Music drifted down corridors. Yet the house itself was sending quiet warnings. The 19th century timber spine, patched and repatched since the 1810s, wasn't designed for a 20th century presidency's mass and machinery. By the late 1930s, even as new diplomacy and looming war demanded polished staging, caretakers knew the structure was tired. There was talk of upgrades, but crises triaged attention elsewhere. The West Wing had been modernized and fire-tested. The residence, camera-ready and tradition-heavy, hid its problems well. You can read the century from the lawn. From the south, the curved portico promises continuity. From the north, the straight one promises order. From the west, the low-slung office wing signals work. The trick of the White House is how convincingly it tells one story from outside while living another inside. By 1940, the outside story was flawless. Inside, the floors were tired singers hitting notes by memory. This chapter began with a rebuild and ends on the edge of another. The first fire had been spectacular. The next crisis would be slow motion and invisible until it wasn't. In a few years, a piano leg would bite through a floor. Engineers would put chalk to beams and blanch. The nation would discover that its most famous mansion needed surgery while keeping its face to the world. By the late 1940s, the White House had the poise of an athlete past his prime. Camera ready, secretly aching. The post-World War II presidency was heavier. More staff, more events, more wiring, more weight. The old timber bones, patched since the 1810s, were tired. The warnings began as murmurs. Door frames out of plumb, plaster fissures, settling you could measure with a thumbnail. Then the house spoke up. One day, during music upstairs, a piano leg punched through the floorboards. Clean through. It was comic for a second, then chilling. If a piano could fall partway through, what else could? Electricians reported hot wires where they shouldn't be. Staff heard unfamiliar pops in the walls. A chandelier quivered when no one walked beneath it. President Harry S. Truman was a practical man with a sentimental streak. He adored the rituals of the office, but he wouldn't stage them in a death trap. Engineers opened floors and found what rumor had promised: massive structural fatigue. The White House was not going to collapse like a movie set, but it was in progressive failure. The fix would be surgery, not cosmetics. In 1948, Truman made the call. Move the first family out, shore up the Symbol Inn. He crossed Pennsylvania Avenue to the Blair House, the official guest house, and turned the executive residence into a construction site. The press loved the storyline. The president displaced from the palace stripped to its bones. What followed is one of the most dramatic architectural transformations in American government. Crews gutted the interior of the White House, room by room, until only the exterior stone walls and a few interior masonry partitions stood like a shell. Photographs from the time look impossible. The East Room is a cavern spanned by temporary beams. Staircases dangle like curiosity shop artifacts. The residence looks as if a tornado removed the inside and forgot the outside. The solution was modern and unapologetically strong. A new steel frame set inside the historic shell, tied to reinforced concrete floors. Imagine building a ship within a bottle, but the bottle is load-bearing and mustn't crack. Workers brought in I-beams through openings cut in the old walls, then assembled a skeleton that would carry the loads the 19th century joists could no longer bear. This wasn't just an engineering triumph, it was an archival one. Before demolition, teams carefully removed paneling, mantles, moldings, and stair parts, numbered them, and stored them for reinstallation or replication. Much could be saved, much was too warped, brittle, or soaked in centuries of repaint to return to service. Truman, aware of the history underfoot, ordered keepsakes made from salvaged timber, small commemorative blocks inscribed and given away. The house's past, literally cut into pieces, found second lives on desks across the country. Let's step inside the most famous rooms while they briefly didn't exist. The East Room, largest in the house, became a jungle of shores and bracing, no plaster, just a volume of air and danger. The state dining room vanished to bare masonry. The grand staircase, which had wandered over the 19th century, was redesigned and rebuilt in a cleaner, more formal line. The old principal staircase location shifted earlier. The Truman Project clarified the approach we know today, a photogenic ascent that every camera understands instantly. Outside, another change sparked headlines. Truman's proposal for a balcony across the south portico. Purists howled. Hadn't the mansion's rear ellipse been perfect for a century? But Truman argued for shade, circulation, and comfort. The balcony would let the family enjoy the view without cooking in summer sun. He also argued it would actually protect the portico below from weather. He won. The Truman balcony, completed in 1948, is now so natural to the silhouette that visitors assume it was always there. While the shell held steady, systems leapt forward half a century. Modern HVAC threaded through chases planned from scratch. Electrical circuits were rationalized. Plumbing made sense for the first time in generations. A bomb shelter and secure spaces, begun in wartime under the East Wing, were integrated into a more coherent infrastructure. The result, a 19th century face with a mid-20th century nervous system. There's an honesty to what Truman allowed. The White House is a symbol, not a reliquary. Preserving its appearance and meaning mattered more than preserving every original molecule. He kept the icon and renewed the instrument. The house had to host statecraft, media, and family life safely. But don't mistake this for a clean, antiseptic modernization. The work was noisy, dusty, and political. Congress guarded the purse, curators mourned lost woodwork, contractors made choices under deadline that later generations debate, recreated plaster details versus authentic fabric, for example. In some rooms, they reinstalled original mantels and paneling. In others, they replicated in new material to match a chosen period effect. The result feels historic, because that was the point, to restore the look of a venerable home while replacing its core. Meanwhile, the president commuted to work from Blair House, crossing the street under the watch of newly cautious security. It was an odd theater, the leader of the free world living across the way because his official home was a skeleton. Truman was frank about the inconvenience and proud of the prudence. He toured the site in a hard hat, smiling that wry Missouri smile at reporters who shouted questions above the din. After 1952, people asked if it was still the White House. Answer: outside, yes. Original walls, original silhouette. Inside, a faithful reconstruction wrapped around a new frame. The memory remained. The structure matured. Costs mounted, as reconstructive surgery tends to. Schedules stretched. But the payoff was visible the first time the great rooms reopened. Chandeliers hung steady, floors didn't hum under a gathering, doors met their jams with authority. The public rooms looked like themselves again, and that was the magic trick: continuity on camera, safety in the numbers. There were choices meant to future-proof the house. The steel and concrete frame allowed heavier loads, cameras, lights, crowds, that media politics would demand. Access panels and service spaces acknowledged that change is the only constant in a working seat of power. The walls could reset without tearing down rooms each time a cable standard changed. The family moved back in 1952, and the country accepted the paradox almost without a blink. People wanted the White House to feel old and be safe. Truman gave them both. He had also left a visible signature, the balcony, that reminded everyone the house evolves. Let's pause on one emotional beat that the photos can't show: the silence of the gutted residence at night. Imagine walking across a temporary catwalk where a ballroom will be, hearing your footfalls echo in a volume of air that used to be echoes of history. You're in a place that is itself between identities. That liminal quality, old skin, new bones, is the climax of our story because it exposes the truth a symbol tries to hide. Endurance isn't stasis, it's maintenance, memory, and change, repeated. When the curtains returned and the cameras rolled, the house looked ageless again. That was by design. The message to the world: America preserves its traditions and invests in its safety. The message to the future: don't wait a century to listen when the beams start talking. The White House could now host the modern presidency without eating itself alive. That fact shapes everything that follows: civil rights meetings, Cold War summits, televised addresses, moments of private grieving and public joy. The rooms where those events unfolded were rebuilt so those events could happen. And yet, even in triumph, the rebuild carried a quiet melancholy. Many touches were gone forever: the hand-worn banister, a craftsman shaped in 1817, the idiosyncratic creak of a specific stair tread, the way a joist flexed just enough to make a chandelier hum during a march. In their place, confidence, capacity, and a standard of safety that finally matched the job. If the first half of our story showed a house built by people the nation tried not to see, and the second showed a myth corrected by an enslaved teenager's memory, this chapter shows the cost of keeping a symbol intact. It's not free, it's not invisible, but it's honest. Begin with a truth that doesn't fit the postcards. Enslaved people lived and worked in the White House during the early administrations. The nation's most public home ran on private labor, much of it coerced. Presidents brought enslaved workers to Washington, hired out others by the month, and built the household economy on practices the new republic refused to call by name when the cameras were on. The contradiction wasn't a side note, it was the operating system. In that world, a teenager named Paul Jennings learned the house by heart. Enslaved to President James Madison, he rose before dawn, moved unseen, and remembered everything. Decades later, free, he published recollections that corrected one of the White House's prettiest legends, the Dolley Madison Portrait Rescue. His memoir did more than adjust a credit, it restored a caste. History became collaborative again, as it had really been all along. Names, schedules list dinners and guests, not the laundress who kept tablecloths white or the groom who cooled a lathered team before an arrival. Payrolls show payments to owners for enslaved labor, not the people who performed it. This is why Jennings matters so much. He put people back into a room the nation had emptied of them. Even as the house ran on hidden labor, it occasionally opened to a public that wanted proof of Republican simplicity. In the 19th century, open houses let citizens file through and shake a president's hand. The ritual looked democratic. The reality remained stratified. Servants, enslaved and free, staged the theater and disappeared. Visitors moved on feeling affirmed. Workers went back downstairs. By the turn of the 20th century, the country had changed. Reconstruction's promises had been crushed in many places. Jim Crow laws hardened segregation. The White House reflected those currents and resisted them, sometimes in the same week. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dinner. It was the first time an African-American leader dined at the White House as a guest of the president. The invitation ignited rage in parts of the press and political establishment. Editorials frothed, letters dripped venom. Roosevelt didn't apologize. He didn't repeat the exact scenario either. The moment stands because it exposed the fault line, national ideals versus local prejudices, staged in the dining room of the National House. Jump ahead to 1914 to 1915, and a pair of episodes that show how the same house can host both protest and propaganda. In November 1914, civil rights editor William Monroe Trotter confronted President Woodrow Wilson in the White House about segregation spreading through federal offices under Wilson's watch. Trotter pressed, Wilson bristled. The meeting was tense, historic, and revealing. Access isn't power, but it can force a reckoning inside rooms designed to make dissent feel impolite. Months later, in 1915, Wilson allowed a private White House screening of The Birth of a Nation. The film glamorized the Ku Klux Klan and smeared Reconstruction. Its showing in the president's house gave it a borrowed legitimacy that amplified its harm. However, one parses Wilson's exact comments, the effect was plain. A racist myth received presidential stage lighting. The House had become a megaphone for a lie. And yet, the same era delivered a different tune. Marian Anderson, one of the greatest contraltos of the 20th century, was barred by the Daughters of the American Revolution from singing in Constitution Hall because she was black. The backlash was immediate. Eleanor Roosevelt resigned her DAR membership in protest. The Roosevelt White House welcomed Anderson to perform. Then, on Easter Sunday 1939, Anderson sang to a crowd of 75,000 at the Lincoln Memorial, her voice carrying over a segregated Capitol. If the White House is a symbol, so is the view from its lawn. The Lincoln Memorial sits on that axis. The message traveled both ways. Between those bookends, the district itself changed. On April 16, 1862, months before the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery ended in Washington, D.C. The law paid former enslavers for lost property, a bitter fact, and allowed some formerly enslaved people to petition for compensation for labor owed, a complicated and limited justice. The White House stood in a city legally transformed but socially contested, a daily reminder that law can move faster than culture. Into the mid-20th century and beyond, the House slowly aligned more of its practice with its promise. Think of civil rights leaders crossing the threshold to press presidents. Think of signings that rattled the old order. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 became law with President Lyndon B. Johnson, calling for a nation that judged by character, not color. The ceremony mattered not just for the words, but for the setting. The White House, rebuilt to handle the weight, now hosted the weightiest kind of inclusion, law. Still, memory inside the mansion remained contested ground. Portraits on the walls told one story for a long time. Invitations told another. Staff rosters, too, evolved. The number of black staff in visible roles grew. Their opportunities changed with administrations. The residence is a workplace as well as a symbol. Promotions and postings record a subtler civil rights history written in job titles and responsibilities. Meanwhile, the White House Historical Association, founded in 1961, began to widen the narrative. Research on enslaved workers connected payroll entries to people. Exhibits foregrounded lives once relegated to footnotes. Public tours still favored sparkle, but more guides learned to point to the service corridors and say aloud what the walls had always held. There's a reason the earlier chapters in this film dwelled on structure. The White House had to change its bones to tell a fuller story safely. Rooms can host breakthroughs only if they don't collapse under the audience. Steel and concrete made space for new weight, television lights, larger crowds, and the press corps that would beam images worldwide in real time. Infrastructure enabled inclusion. It's tempting to imagine a finish line, an arc bending neatly from exclusion to equity. The house resists that. It reflects the country, lurching, contradicting itself, haunted and hopeful at once. A film screening that dignified racism sits in the same lineage as a concert that defied it. A dinner that sparked backlash opens a path to guest lists that look more like America. The ledger still needs new entries, but it exists now, not just in scholars' files, on the tour scripts, in the exhibits, in the choices for who stands near a president when the cameras click. The most honest way to see the White House may be as a mirror disguised as a mansion. If you want to know where the country is, watch who crosses its threshold and what they are there to do. If a child from a school far from Washington gets to stand under the East Room's glitter and hear the story of Paul Jennings as part of the main narrative, not the footnote, that's a small change with a large echo. We've walked through erasure and protest, backlash and breakthroughs. The rooms did not change their dimensions, but the we inside them did. From the hands that cleaned the crystal to the faces beaming on the receiving line. None of this erases the first chapter's truth. The house was raised by people denied freedom. It does, however, claim a fuller version of the symbol, one where the ledger starts with dead and ends, we hope, with recognition, and more equal claims to the space. Step back from the trivia and the tours. What is the White House really? It's a ledger written in stone and paint, in payrolls and place settings, in names we learned in school and names we're only now learning to say. It is honest when we let it be, and it lies a little when we insist on postcard stories. Here is the core truth we promise to deliver. The same White House is not the same. It was raised by enslaved labor, burned and rebuilt, nearly failed from within, and then remade with a steel spine behind a familiar face. The symbol stayed. The interior changed so the symbol could continue doing its job. If you think that's a cheat, consider every family home that's ever added a beam, replaced a roof, or rewired a dangerous circuit to keep a history alive. What we do with that truth is the real test. One option is to keep the contradiction as decor, a tasteful nod to a darker past, a plaque on a wall, and then back to the chandeliers. The better option is harder. We fold the contradiction into the main story where it belongs. We say aloud on tours and in classrooms that the people who cooked and carried and cut stone were part of the founding work, and that their descendants have a right to see themselves in the house they helped make. If the first chapters showed a country that hid labor and loved legends, the later ones show a different instinct, to revise, to correct, to include even when inclusion sparks backlash. The White House is a stage, but stages can host different plays. A dinner that scandalized 1901 is an expected guest list now. A film that poisoned 1915 is a cautionary tale taught beside a 1939 concert that broke a barrier for the world to hear. There is also the quieter duty, maintenance. The beam that doesn't creak, the wire that doesn't overheat, the duct that makes a room comfortable for a long meeting, these are civic virtues hiding as infrastructure. The Truman rebuild didn't just save a building. It made room for the modern presidency and all the public rituals we use to say who we are. Without it, the house would have sagged under its own history, and the nation would have lost a stage that, for all its contradictions, remains unmatched as a space where the public meets power. The final beat is reflection. The White House will keep changing, because the country will. New portraits go up, new policies get signed, new conflicts play out under the same chandeliers. Our job as people who watch and vote and visit is to notice who is visible and who is missing, to push for the ledger to balance a little more each year, and to remember that a house becomes a home only when everyone who built it is recognized inside it. One last image before we close. Dawn on the south lawn. The columns catch pink light, the fountain hisses, a robin skims the grass. Underneath, a modern frame holds steady. Inside, staff set tables, brief a president, polish a floor that once failed a piano leg. In a basement storage room, tags still hang from rescued mantles and numbered panels, a physical index of how the house has survived by changing. The day's guests will see elegance. You will see the ledger behind the shine. This has been a story about a symbol that's more honest and more powerful when we tell it whole. When you next see the White House on a screen or from the sidewalk, remember the quarry's rhythm, the fire's heat, the riveter's clatter, and the singer's sustained note over the reflecting pool. All of them live in the house now if we let them.